The last thing I remember before the hood came down was the bracelet. Not the screaming. Not the tires. Not the sound my knees made when they hit the concrete floor of that van. The bracelet. Silver. Simple. A little too tight on my left wrist. The way it always was when the Texas humidity swelled my fingers. I remember it catching the fluorescent light of level 3 just for a second, just 1/2 second flash of silver, before a hand closed around my arm and the world became motion and darkness and the smell of motor oil and old canvas. That bracelet was the reason I am alive. And the man who put it there, my father, was sitting 73 miles away in a dark kitchen, watching a blinking blue dot crawl across a map of the Texas Hill Country, willing it not to stop. It stopped at 2:41 in the morning. That's when everything changed. My name is Callie Marsh. At the time this happened, I was 22 years old, 11 months out of college, and working as a junior logistics analyst for a mid-size freight company called Trident Cargo Solutions on the northwest side of Houston. I tracked shipments. I built routing spreadsheets. Flagged delays. I made $47,000 a year and felt quietly proud of it because I had gotten the job myself. No connections, no family pull. Just a supply chain internship I had hustled for during my junior year at UT Austin, and a reference letter from a professor who barely knew my name but respected my final project enough to sign his name to it. I tell you that because it matters. It matters that I was not the kind of person anything happens to. I was organized. I was careful. I texted people when I arrived somewhere. Parked under lights. My father, Raymond Marsh Ray, to everyone who knew him, had spent 24 years as a special agent with the FBI. Organized crime. Human trafficking task forces. He had worked cases in Dallas, San Antonio, and a 3-year stint in Miami that he never talked about in detail, but that had permanently changed the way he looked at parking lots, hotel lobbies, and any room with only one exit. He retired when I was 19. He moved back to Kerrville, bought 11 acres and started keeping bees. That is the image most people had of him. A quiet man with hives and a porch and a dog named Gus. What people didn't see was the way he still checked the locks twice every time he visited my apartment. The way he sat facing the door in every restaurant we ever went to together. The way he paused, just slightly, just half a breath, whenever I mentioned a new coworker or a new route I was driving regularly. He never explained it. I never asked. I should have asked. 6 months before the parking garage, a small package arrived at my apartment. No Amazon label. No return address printed. Just Ray Marsh, 4412 Cedar Ridge Road, Kerrville, Texas, written in my father's handwriting. Block letters. The kind of handwriting that had filled out thousands of federal forms over 24 years and never once learned to be casual about it. Inside was a bracelet. Silver chain. Simple clasp. A small oval charm in the center. Smooth on both sides, engraved with nothing. No note. No card. Just the bracelet wrapped in a square of brown tissue paper like he had packed it himself on the kitchen table. Called him immediately. Dad. Did you send me a bracelet? Yeah. Why? Was. The kind of pause that with Ray didn't mean he was searching for words. It meant he had already chosen them carefully and was deciding whether to use them. Just wear it, he said. Every day. Don't take it off at the gym. Dad, that's a weird thing to say. Callie. What? Every day. And that was the end of the conversation. That I thought about it for maybe 2 days. I turned it over in my hands, looked at the charm under my phone light, pressed my thumbnail against both sides of the oval. It felt slightly heavier than it looked. I told myself that was just the quality of the silver. I almost left it in my jewelry dish. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I almost left it on my nightstand the morning of February 11th because I was running 4 minutes late and the clasp was fiddly and I was wearing a long-sleeve blouse anyway so no one would even see it. I put it on because of my cousin Danny. Danny was 26 when she was taken from a mall parking lot in San Marcos 14 months earlier. She was gone for 9 days. She came back, thank God she came back, But the version of her that came back was different in ways that our whole family was still quietly learning to navigate. My father had worked her case personally, off the books, calling in favors from people he hadn't spoken to in years. He had not slept more than 3 hours a night for those 9 days. I know because my aunt told me, and my aunt doesn't exaggerate. After Danny came home, my father changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the small calibrations of his behavior that I had learned to read the way you learn to read weather. He started asking where I parked. He asked once, casually, if my company did a lot of work with third-party freight contractors. He drove to Houston in March, took me to dinner, walked me to my car, and stood there for a moment looking at the garage structure like he was memorizing its weak points. He never said he was afraid. But I understand now that the bracelet was the sentence he didn't know how to speak out loud. I know what this city can do. I know what men are capable of. I know because I spent 24 years cataloging it. And I cannot be with you every second. So I am putting the next best thing on your wrist and I am asking you, please not to take it off at the gym. That was the whole conversation. Translated, I put the bracelet on. I walked out the door at 8:07 a.m. And I had no idea that 13 hours later, it would be the only thing standing between me and disappearing completely. February 11th was a Thursday. We had a team happy hour after work. Nothing special, just 8 people from the logistics floor at a bar called Draft and Barrel on Westheimer. I had 2 drinks over 3 hours. I was careful about that. I was always careful about that. I left at 10:47 p.m. I know because I checked my phone in the elevator, and I remember thinking I needed to text my roommate that I was on my way home. I never sent that text. Level 3 of the Meridian Plaza garage was where I always parked when I worked late because the elevator bank was closest to the stairwell exit and the lighting on that level was better than level 2. I had parked there 40, maybe 50 times. I knew the smell of it. That specific mix of exhaust and concrete dust and something faintly chemical from the drainage system near the east wall. I knew the sound of it. The low hum of the ventilation shaft above spot 3G. The way footsteps echoed differently near the support columns. I knew that garage. Which is why I noticed immediately that the white cargo van in spot 3K had not been there at 8 a.m. I noticed it. I registered it. And then I made the mistake that I have replayed in my head approximately 10,000 times since that night. I kept walking. They were fast. Professionally fast. Not panicked, not clumsy. Fast in the way that told me, even in the first 3 seconds, that they had done this before. One came from my left between 2 parked cars. One came from behind. The third was already at the van's side door. There was a brief struggle. I want to be honest about that. I did fight. I got one elbow into something solid and heard a grunt. And then something pressed against the side of my neck and the world went warm and slow and then it went away entirely. I woke up on the floor of the van. My wrists were cable-tied in front of me. There was a canvas hood over my head, dark brown, smelling like it had been used before. The floor was metal and cold and vibrating with highway speed. No carpet, no padding. Just cold corrugated metal and the sound of tires on asphalt and 3 men who were not speaking to each other. That silence was the most frightening thing. Men who have done this before don't need to talk. I did what my father's voice, always somewhere in the back of my head, told me to do. Counted. Left turn. Freight. Long straight highway speed, maybe 20 minutes. Right turn, rougher road. Left. Lower now. Gravel. Up. Counted turns. I counted seconds between turns. I pressed my bound wrists against the floor and felt the road texture change from smooth asphalt to chip seal to gravel to something unpaved and uneven. I noted when the van tilted slightly, a hill or a cattle guard. I noted when the engine sound changed, elevation, or dense tree cover muffling the exhaust. I was terrified. I want to be clear about that. My heart was doing something that didn't feel like a heartbeat anymore. More like a fist hitting a wall repeatedly from the inside. But I was also, and I don't know how to explain this except that it is true, I was also thinking. Very clearly. Very quietly. My father's voice. Always my father's voice. Count. Breathe. Notice. 6 hours passed. I know it was 6 hours because at some point they stopped, and through the hood I could feel the temperature had dropped dramatically. The kind of cold that only comes deep into a Texas February night when you are far from the city and far from anything that generates heat or light or noise. They put me in a structure. Wood floor. Old wood. I could feel the give in it through my bare feet where one shoe had come off in the struggle. Door closed. A lock. Not a deadbolt, something older, a latch or a bar. And then silence. Complete rural total silence. And then, 1 bar of signal. My phone was gone. But the bracelet was still on my wrist. And somewhere 73 miles away, a man who had spent 24 years hunting people who do exactly what had just been done to me, was watching a blinking blue dot on a map go completely, utterly still. I need to tell you what my father was doing while I was in that van. I know this because he told me afterward, sitting at his kitchen table in Kerrville with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. His hands flat on the table the way they always are when he is being precise about something. He told me everything. In order. The way a man trained to document tells a story. Not with emotion first, but with sequence, because sequence is how you understand what actually happened and why. He had been watching the tracker since 11:14 p.m. He had a modified app on his phone. Not consumer grade, something a former colleague had built for exactly this kind of purpose. That pinged the bracelet's GPS chip every 90 seconds and logged the coordinates with a timestamp. He had set a silent alarm for any movement after 11 p.m. on a weeknight. The alarm went off at 11:09. He watched the dot move out of the Meridian Plaza garage. He watched it get onto Westheimer. He watched it merge onto I-10 West. And that was when he knew, because my car was parked in that garage and I had told him I was going to a bar 2 blocks away. And there was no reason at all, for my signal to be moving west on the interstate at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. He called me at 11:12. No answer. He called again at 11:15. No answer. He did not call a third time. Instead he called a man named Dennis Hale. His former partner, 22 years FBI, now a senior investigator with the Harris County District Attorney's Office, and said 4 words. I need a trace. While Dennis worked the cell towers, my father was already in his truck. Kerrville to the outskirts of Blanco is roughly 70 miles on US 290. He drove it in 51 minutes. He has never told me exactly how fast that means he was going, and I have never asked. He watched the dot the entire drive. Passenger seat, phone mounted. The blue signal crawling deeper into the hill country on FM 1323, a farm road he knew from a case in 2009. He cross-referenced the route against his memory of that case, the land out there, the structures, the kind of isolation it offered. And then at 2:41 a.m. the dot stopped moving. He told me he sat with that for exactly 30 seconds. Just looked at it. A stationary blue dot coordinates he could map to a stretch of FM 1323 near a small community called FB Creek. Nothing out there except cedar scrub, ranch land, and old agricultural structures that hadn't been actively farmed in years. 30 seconds. Then he called Dennis again, gave him the coordinates, and told him to have units rolling. Then he looked at his phone one more time. 1 bar of signal. He pressed call. Connected. And he said the 8 words that I will hear for the rest of my life, in his voice, exactly as he said them. Calm and certain and absolutely without wasted syllables. They know where you are. Take nothing. Run right now. 4 seconds. That is how long the call lasted. 8 words, 1 breath of silence where I didn't speak because there was nothing to say. And then the line dropped back to nothing. 4 seconds was enough. I want to explain something about what happens to your body in a moment like that. Not the fear part, everyone can imagine the fear part, but the other thing that happens, the thing underneath the fear, when someone you completely trust speaks to you with complete certainty in the worst moment of your life. Something in your nervous system makes a decision before your brain catches up. The decision is simple. Move. My wrists were still cable-tied but in front of me, which mattered. I had been working at the tie for most of the 6 hours, not desperately, not constantly, just methodically, the way you work a knot you know you have time on. The plastic had loosened maybe 30%. Not enough to slip free, but enough that my hands had some independent movement. I stood up in the dark. The structure was small. I could tell by the acoustics. Sound doesn't travel the same way in a small wooden space. It comes back to you faster, flatter. Old wood, I had felt that through my feet when they brought me in. Which meant old construction. Which meant weak points that 70 or 80 years of Texas weather had been quietly working on long before I arrived. I moved toward where I had heard the door close. I found it with my bound hands. Rough wood, old iron hardware, a bar latch on the outside which meant they had not expected me to be mobile. Which told me something about whatever they had pressed against my neck in the garage and how long they expected it to last. They had miscalculated. I pressed my shoulder against the door. Solid at the top. Solid in the middle. But at the lower right corner near the floor a give. Flex. The sound of wood that has been swollen and dried and swollen again across too many seasons. I stepped back as far as the space allowed. Kick. Not a movie kick. I'm 5'4" and 130 pounds and my hands were tied and I was barefoot on the other foot now too. But I kicked with everything I had, heel first, directly at that lower right corner. And the sound it made was not a crash. It was a crack. A dry, quiet, splintering crack that I was terrified would bring someone running. Nobody came. Kicked again. And again. On the fourth kick the lower panel split and a piece of wood roughly the size of a cafeteria tray swung outward and I felt cold air. Rail cold air, open field cold air, come through the gap. I went through it on my hands and knees. The ground outside was frozen. Not snow. Texas doesn't do snow cleanly. But that particular February condition where the overnight temperature has dropped fast enough to put a crust of ice over the top of the mud and the dead grass so that every step sounds like you're walking on broken crackers. Every step I took was loud to me. Every step felt like a signal flare. I ran anyway. I ran because my father had said run, and in 22 years he had never told me to do anything that turned out to be wrong. I could not see a road. I could not see lights. I could see approximately nothing except the slightly less dark line of the horizon where the sky met the land, and I ran toward that because it was the only direction that was not the structure behind me, and not the cedar scrub to my left which would slow me down and hide me but also hide anything coming after me. Damn my feet. I need to tell you about my feet because I don't want to be dramatic about it, but I also don't want to skip it because it is the most physically real thing about that night, and it is the thing that made it impossible to pretend it hadn't happened afterward. Frozen ground and gravel on bare feet in February is not something your body forgets quickly. I ran on it for what I later learned was approximately 2.3 miles. I know that because Dennis Hale's team measured it the next day. 2.3 miles. I did not stop. I hit the asphalt of FM 1323 and turned east because my count of the turns told me east was back toward the highway and the highway was back toward everything that meant safety and light and other human beings who were not those three men. And then I saw headlights. Coming fast. High beams. A black pickup truck that I recognized. God help me, I recognized it by its headlights before I could even see the shape of it, the way you recognize a person by how they walk before you see their face. My father's truck. Driver's door already open. Engine still running. Him standing in the gap between the door and the frame, one hand on the roof, looking down the road at me. He did not run toward me. He waited. I think because he knew if he ran toward me in the dark on a rural road after everything that had just happened, some part of my nervous system might not be able to tell the difference. He waited. He let me come to him. When I reached him, he put his jacket around my shoulders without speaking. Then he looked down at my feet, just looked for a moment the way a person who has trained themselves never to react still sometimes reacts, and then he looked back up at me. You ran the right direction, he said. That was all. We got in the truck. 3 arrests were made within 72 hours. Dennis Hale's team had units at those coordinates within 19 minutes of my father's second call. They found the structure, an abandoned hay storage barn off a private ranch road that had been leased under a shell company name registered in Laredo. They found evidence of prior occupation. They found zip ties. They found a burner phone with texts that opened up something much larger than 3 men and a cargo van. The federal investigation that followed lasted 14 months. What they found when they pulled the thread was a freight routing network, a system of falsified manifests and shell logistics companies that used legitimate cargo routes to move people. Mostly women. Mostly young. Mostly taken from urban parking structures in mid-sized Texas cities because urban parking structures have inconsistent camera coverage and nobody thinks twice about a cargo van. Here is the part that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. 2 of the shell companies in that network had contracts with freight brokers who did business with Trident Cargo Solutions. My company. The routing spreadsheets I had been building for 11 months, the ones I had been quietly proud of, had been, in some small procedural way, adjacent to this. My father had known that freight routing in Houston carried risk. That was why he had asked me, casually, at dinner in March, whether my company worked with a lot of third-party contractors. He had known. He had not told me because telling me would have required explaining things he wasn't certain of yet and frightening me without being able to protect me simultaneously. So instead he had put a GPS chip inside a silver bracelet and mailed it to my apartment and asked me to wear it every day. 2 weeks after that night, sitting at his kitchen table in Kerrville with Gus asleep under my chair and the bees quiet in the February cold outside, I asked him why he hadn't just told me to be careful. He looked at his coffee for a moment. "Careful doesn't have coordinates," he said. I have thought about that sentence almost every day since. What I know now, what that night rearranged permanently in me, is that love is not always a language. Sometimes it is a decision made at a kitchen table 6 months before the moment it is needed. Sometimes it is a modified app pinging a GPS chip every 90 seconds through the night. Sometimes it is 51 miles driven in 39 minutes on a farm road in the hill country dark. Sometimes it is a door already open. Sometimes it is waiting at the end of the road and letting you come the rest of the way yourself because you need to arrive on your own 2 feet. I arrived and I want to tell you what happened to me in the months after that night. Not the legal parts, I have already told you those. I mean what happened inside me. Because that part is slower and quieter and nobody writes a federal report about it, but it is just as real and in some ways it has mattered more. For the first 3 weeks I slept with every light in my apartment on. Not because I was afraid of the dark specifically. More because darkness had become associated, in some deep animal part of my brain, with the inside of a canvas hood and the smell of motor oil and the sound of a van door sliding shut. My body had learned something that my mind was still trying to argue with. And the lights were the compromise I made with myself while I waited for the 2 parts to catch up to each other. I saw a therapist. I want to say that plainly because I think there is still a version of this story where the woman who escapes is supposed to be fine afterward, supposed to be strong and resolved and immediately okay. I was not immediately okay. I was someone who had been through something significant and who needed professional help to process it, and I got that help and it worked, and I am not ashamed of any part of that sentence. I also quit Trident Cargo Solutions. Not dramatically. Not in a speech. I gave 4 weeks' notice, finished my outstanding projects with the same care I had always given them, shook hands with people I genuinely liked, and walked out of that building on a Friday afternoon in April with a box of desk things and a very clear sense that I was done. Took 3 months. I went to Kerrville. I stayed in my father's spare room and I helped him with the bees. Something I had never done before and something that turns out to require a quality I was very much in the process of rebuilding, which is the ability to be calm and present and unbothered by things moving around you that could theoretically cause harm but almost certainly won't if you just breathe and stay steady. My father and I talked more in those 3 months than we had in the previous 5 years combined. Not about the case. Not about the network or the arrests or the federal investigation or the 14 months of proceedings that followed. We talked about other things. His time in Miami. My grandmother, his mother, who he said I reminded him of in ways he had never figured out how to articulate. The bees. The land. What he planned to do with the 11 acres eventually. What I was thinking about doing next, he told me once, on a Saturday morning in May when we were checking the hives and the hill country was doing that thing it does in late spring where everything smells like cedar and something flowering underneath the cedar. He told me that the night of February 11th was the longest night of his life. Longer than any night he had spent on any case in 24 years. Because on those nights the person in danger was a file number and a photograph. On this night the person in danger was the person he had been most afraid of losing since the day she was born. He said it to the beehive, not to me. I let him say it that way. Because I understood by then that this was his language. Sideways, practical. Delivered to a neutral object so that the emotion didn't have to be looked at directly. I had spent 22 years wishing he would just say things to me. And I had spent those 3 months in Kerrville learning that he had been saying things to me the entire time. In the bracelet. In the twice-checked locks. In the restaurant seat facing the door. In the app he had running silently on his phone that pinged my location every 90 seconds through the night. In the door he left open. I started a new job in September. Supply chain risk consulting, which is, I will acknowledge, a somewhat pointed career pivot given everything. I work with companies now to identify vulnerabilities in their freight networks, gaps in contractor vetting, weaknesses in logistics oversight that bad actors know how to exploit. I am good at it. I wear the bracelet every day. Not because of the tracker. The original chip was removed and documented as evidence, and the bracelet was returned to me 6 months later in a small evidence envelope with a chain of custody sticker on it. I wear it because of what it means. Because somewhere in that small oval charm is the compressed version of everything my father couldn't say. And now I don't need him to say it anymore because I already know it and I carry it with me, and it turns out that is enough. More than enough. If you are listening to this and you have a person in your life whose love doesn't always use words, a parent, a partner, a friend who shows up rather than speaks up, I hope this story gave you a new way to look at that. Not every declaration sounds like a declaration. Some of them look like a package with no return note. Some of them look like a truck on a dark road with the door already open. And if you are listening to this and you are the quiet one, the one who prepares instead of promises, who acts instead of announces, who puts the tracker in the bracelet instead of saying I'm terrified of losing you. See you. I think I finally understand you. And I think that kind of love, the kind that shows up with coordinates instead of poetry, that might be the bravest kind there is. If this story stayed with you, if something in it hit differently than you expected, I want to hear from you. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me if you have someone in your life who loves like my father loves. Or tell me if you are that person. The one who shows up without explaining why, who prepares without announcing it, who puts something in place long before anyone knows it will be needed. Those people deserve to be seen. If you are new here, this channel is where stories like this one live. Real stories. Human stories. The kind that don't end with everything fixed but with something better, with clarity. With the understanding that you were never as alone as you felt in the hardest moments. Subscribe if you want more of that. And if this is the first story of mine you've heard, welcome. I'm glad you found it. I'm glad you stayed until the end. Because the end, it turns out, is always just the beginning of something quieter and better and more yours than what came before it.